Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is Bob Lorem, VP of Marketing at Exact Data Discovery. I wanted to welcome you personally to today's webinar entitled Leveraging Technology and Talent to Streamline Document Review. All right, so again, welcome everyone. And we really appreciate you joining. This is the 11th webinar of our educational webinar series from Exact Data Discovery. And this is actually a repeat performance from Chris Chapman, who will be our presenter today, that we did early on last year when we first started the program. And we had close to 300 people a year ago, and we got close to 300 people joining us again today, all with diverse backgrounds and law firms and corporations with all different kinds of titles. So welcome to everybody that's joining. The topic today, obviously, on managed review, a pretty hot topic in the industry right now, as law firms and corporations look for ways to minimize the cost of managing matters either internally or externally with third-party counsel. So again, welcome to the show. I'd like to also welcome personally a new member to the Exact Data Discovery team, a friend and colleague of mine named Matthew Verga, who I had the pleasure of working with in previous companies. We brought him in to help us expand the program for educational content relative to webinars, white papers, and blog articles. So if you get a chance, make sure to visit the Learn section of the Exact Data Discovery website, where you'll find all kinds of incredibly powerful content written on a variety of topics that will help make your jobs better in your organization. So again, welcome to Team Matthew. You will, in webinars moving forward, you'll also hear Matthew's voice a lot. He'll be presenting some topics on multiple different areas and does a really great job with presentations. So as always with our webinars, everyone, feel free to submit your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen if that's where it's at, and we'll do our best to answer them during the show. However, we may leave some of them toward the end so Chris can get through his powerful content that he has today. And as always, the slides, recording, and the survey will be coming tomorrow via an email from Exact Data Discovery. So just when you thought it was safe to check your email box to not see another email campaign from Bob, you're going to get one more on this webinar that says, hey, click here, access the page, and you can download the recording and grab the slides, etc. So, all right, with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. This is Chris Chapman, and as mentioned before, he did this webinar about a year ago. Chris is our Regional Vice President of Managed Review Services at Exact. He manages anywhere from 100 to close to 400 managed review attorneys at any given time, depending on the amount of projects we have coming in and out of the organization. So, and he does that across 3 locations in the country: Chicago, Salt Lake, and Detroit. So Chris is a Chicago native himself, and as he mentioned earlier to me, he's in Salt Lake today watching it snow, where it's 86 and sunny here in Boston. So again, Chris has a ton of experience as a litigation attorney, as you can see. So it's really, he's got some content that comes from the perspective of an attorney, which is really helpful. And he's also got 9 years or more as e-discovery attorney and document review manager. So, it's a really good combination of talent, skills, and experience that Chris brings to the table. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Chapman to the group. And Chris, it's all yours, and we'll pop in periodically with questions and answers. Have fun.
Thanks, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the webinar discussing leveraging technology in managed review projects. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart, of course. This is what we do on a daily basis, working on client projects, utilizing both analytics and human review, and sometimes computer-assisted review as we work to meet our clients' objectives. The presentation today, we're going to focus on several areas relating to managing a review project. First, we're going to talk a little bit about proportionality and the scope of discovery and how that colors our processes that we're going to put in place for any particular review. And then we're going to talk a little bit about effective searching and culling and how we manage our information and define a review set in the most efficient way possible. Then we're going to talk about how we can bring data analytics into the process to bring further efficiencies into our workflow, and on top of that, how we can utilize technology-assisted review when that's appropriate to further refine the process. And then finally, we'll talk about the actual linear review process and at what point we bring review attorneys in to complete a review or work through a review set in addition to the previous tools that we will have discussed.
Hey, Chris, we're getting a couple of requests for you to speak up a little bit louder or turn your mic up a little if you could.
Will do. Is that
Thank
a
you,
little
sir.
better?
Indeed.
Perfect. So first we're going to talk proportionality and how that colors our process when we're developing a review workflow and deciding what tools would be appropriate to employ in order to accomplish our review objectives. All of this is really laid out in the new federal rules. Rule 26 essentially codifies the concept of proportionality and the analysis that you would undertake in order to determine whether a particular discovery effort is something that would be required under the federal rules. The interesting change here is that the focus is now on relevance, not necessarily whether or not something is going to be admissible in evidence. And in the comments, there is specific mention of technology and technology-assisted review and a request that parties consider technology and consider technology-assisted review and the impact that those tools can have on the review process, particularly with regard to costs, in order to help you define your scope of discovery and your discovery plan. So the factors to consider in a proportionality analysis are laid out there in the rule. We're going to go through them a little bit one by one and talk a little bit about recent case law and how they've impacted this analysis. So first is the importance of the issues at stake in the action. This is more of a societal importance type of question. They want to know, is this a case that will impact all consumers of a particular product around the country, tens of thousands of people, or is this going to be something that impacts two particular businesses that have a dispute with one another over a contractual relationship or something of that nature? And the overall impact on society as a whole is going to kind of help color the extent of each party's burden in the discovery process. Another part of the analysis is the amount in controversy. What is the relative value of the case versus the expense of the requested discovery? What is the party's relative access to the information in question? Are you dealing with an individual that is suing a large corporation that controls all the information relating to the development of a product? Or is this something that was more of an arm's length transaction with two companies sharing information, in sort of a due diligence process where they both should have access to most of the relevant information? You also look to the parties' respective resources. This is kind of related to the access to the information piece. And key in a lot of the recent cases is the importance of the information in resolving the issues. So a lot of the case law that we've seen over the last year and a half dealing with proportionality has specifically addressed the question of whether a particular set of data that's being requested to be produced is likely to lead to relevant evidence, and beyond that, evidence that would help resolve the issues in the case, and how important is it to that potential resolution of those issues. Most of the courts have held that the burden is on the party seeking the discovery to show that initial level of relevance. Is the evidence they're seeking really relevant to the issues in the case? Once they show that, we then shift the burden to the party that's responding to the discovery request, and they have to show whether the burden or expense of producing that information would outweigh that benefit of finding the relevant information that the party is seeking, the other party is seeking. So before we move on to searching and culling, any questions about that general overview of proportionality and the proportionality analysis?
No questions at the moment, Chris. We are all set to proceed.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to start with a brief discussion of information governance. So one thing that's key to a successful searching and culling effort when you're asked to produce documents in a litigation matter or need to access documents or data for an investigation is that you have that information organized in such a way that you're likely to be successful and minimize your cost in that process. So for that reason, it's important to have in place an information governance process and procedure that your team follows. It's important to have a defensible deletion policy so you can minimize the scope of the data that you keep and only keep that data which is important or required for either compliance purposes, business purposes, or legal purposes. Once you have that policy in place and that process in place and your data is organized in such a way that you can track it, what it's related to, how long you need to keep it, whether it's something you need to keep for particular compliance reasons or particular ongoing litigation or litigation likely to arise. You can categorize that information within your system and make it that much easier to track. It's important to have a central repository of your data, especially to the extent you have users that are using mobile communication tools, tablets, or phones to send and receive emails. To the extent you can back those up in real time or as close to it as possible on your system, central system, the less burdensome it will be to go out and collect from all those devices any additional data that you need. But to the extent you don't have all of that centrally located, it's important to remember that you do need to collect from all those mobile sources any potentially relevant information. I know there's been some recent discussion, and there's an upcoming Sedona article about this that deals with it potentially being malpractice if you don't collect those mobile devices. Lastly, it's important that you have in place a litigation hold process that you can track and that's documented so that you can ensure that you're meeting all of your burdens and requirements with regard to preserving data for when a litigation or investigation matter arises. The next step to effective searching and culling is subject matter expertise about the case. Having someone that knows the case, knows the players, knows the issues, and can help you develop an effective set of search terms quickly and efficiently that will narrow down your set as much as possible. If you just have a general idea or you have a broad scope to your search, you're likely to pull in a lot of data that's not really relevant and that will increase your costs at both the processing phase, the review phase, the production phase. So to the extent you can have someone that can really help you hone in on the issues in the case and what you have in your system that's relevant to those issues, the more successful that effort is likely to be. It's also important as early as possible in the process to consider privilege screening and to consider where you might have privileged documents or most likely have privileged documents stored in your system. That might be by narrowing down particular custodians, which custodians would have had interactions with legal and when, and which custodians might not, what the date ranges were for the likely interactions with legal would have been. You know, not every project's going to have legal involvement from the outset, but to the extent you know when that legal involvement began and how long it continued, that can really help you narrow down and segregate potentially privileged documents so they don't get into your review, your main review set, and you can segregate those and have a separate privilege review. It's also important that you know your data. You need to know the forms of data that you will receive. What do you have in your system? What types of email platforms are you using? what file types do you have? Do you have any videos or flash or animation or models that won't necessarily be something you could analyze in an online platform like Relativity? Is there some other way you will need to review those documents? And then it's also important to consider production with those types of files. Is there any special consideration you need to follow in order to create a production based on the different types of data you'll have and the types of data that you'll be able to produce and those that you'll have to produce natively versus in image format, and what metadata do you have tied to those files, and how will you be producing that metadata and to what extent? So it's very important, even early on, that you have a handle on all those different data types and how they're going to affect your review plan from the processing phase all the way through, actually from the collection phase through processing all the way through to review and production. This is also relevant to the issues of utilizing technology. Some of these file types may or may not lend themselves to using particular kinds of technology-assisted review or analytics. Text-based platforms, for example, won't help you much if you have a lot of computer animations or spreadsheets with numbers or things like that that are relevant to your case. You'll need to come up with another way to introduce those into your review. All right, so before we move on to a discussion of different data analytics tools, do we have any questions about searching and calling?
No questions at this time, Chris.
All right, we'll move on to data analytics. So it's important to consider what tools you have available and consider the right technology solutions. Different platforms have different tools that can help you to introduce data analytics into your review workflow and or assisted review into your review workflow. Our primary platform that we use here at Exact is Relativity. And so our available tools are the Relativity Analytics Suite as well as Relativity Assisted Review. The primary analytics tools we use on a day-to-day basis in our review projects are email threading analysis, near duplicate detection, and conceptual search and clustering. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those in more detail as we move through the presentation. And we also pretty frequently use Relativity Assisted Review in a number of different ways. We sometimes use it as a review tool, but we more often use it as a culling tool to remove non-responsive content from our data set, at the outset of the process. So we don't have to have a review team linearly review all of that non-responsive content. And then we also often use it as a prioritization tool to help us isolate that content which is most likely to be responsive so we can review that first. So incorporating analytics into your review is an important step, and it's important that you consider that at the outset of your process. Once you know you're going to be reviewing documents, you want to initially consider what type of data you have coming in. More often than not, it'll be an email collection. So you'll want to structure your review to take advantage of email threading and that analytic tool so you can build a workflow that's as efficient as possible in getting through that set of email data. We typically will run the threading analysis and identify each email conversation in its entirety and batch those together for our review team. We can organize our review in such a way that we don't have one reviewer seeing one piece of a conversation and another reviewer seeing a different piece. Instead, we have the same reviewer at the first level working through that entire conversation, seeing all the documents together. If they encounter privileged content in that conversation, they can go through the entire thread and make sure it's all consistently coded for privilege and that everything is caught. at the first level, and that's also something you can utilize as a QC tool later on. To the extent you have emails that are added to a process, or a reviewer that may have missed a document in an email thread, you can break down your QC batches by email conversation as well and point your team, your QC team, to those threads that have inconsistent privilege coding so you can verify that that's correct, or see if there's an issue that needs to be addressed. Another use for email threading is to help you remove lesser included emails and streamline your review. We've typically seen email sets that have around a third of the content will be inclusive or unique emails that contain all of the actual content or data in each email conversation. The lesser included content will be in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the content, 67% or so, that we don't necessarily need to review. All that content is contained in those other emails, those longer parts of the chain. Relativity, for example, will help us identify both at the email level and the attachment level all of the unique content that's in each email thread. So we use that regularly to streamline our reviews and remove up to 2/3 of the content so that we're not spending time reviewing things that have already been looked at and categorized by our team. We often use the near duplicate tool similarly. We will find documents that are, especially when we're dealing with loose files, we'll find documents that have been categorized one way and look at the rest of the near duplicate documents in that set to make sure they're treated similarly. Tools such as keyword expansion, categorization, find similar documents, and clustering can also help us to find key documents more quickly. We often use those when we're doing depot prep or looking for hot documents. If we find one hot document, we can use one of these tools, typically clustering, to find other documents in the data set that relate to that particular concept. And that'll help us nail down which is the most complete version of that document, or the best version of that document, or the worst version of that document that we need to know about as we prepare for deposition or trial. So here's a brief visual representation of email threading and how we use it. And I've already kind of mentioned our process here. These lesser included emails, will be replies to an original email, a reply to that email, and then finally the third reply to each of those emails. Those replies, the top green, the top level replies that are highlighted in green here, those are the most complete versions of those email threads. In the second example, inclusive email to reply, you also have a forward that was sent to someone else of that original email. So instead of reviewing all 7 of these documents, we can look at just the 3 that are highlighted in green and see all of the content that's available in this data set relating to these 2 conversations. So whenever possible, we try to structure our reviews to set up the batches in this way so that our reviewers are only seeing those green emails and not spending time going through the lesser included emails. Similarly, near duplicate analysis is available in Relativity to help you find documents that are maybe not exact duplicates for purposes of their MD5 hash value, but that contain the same content. So we can be sure that our documents, that we're not looking at documents that are the same multiple times. And that's been a very valuable tool, less so for culling purposes in our data sets, but for QC purposes, making sure that if we find a document that's potentially privileged, for example, a spreadsheet that contains an entry about privileged content that may be difficult to find for a reviewer that's moving through the data set, we can find every example of that content in the data set using near duplicate analysis and ensure that all of the privileged materials are withheld. or redacted, as the case may be. Lastly, conceptual search and clustering, as I mentioned, that's a tool we primarily use when we are conducting, a depot prep review. If we want to drill down on hot documents and find everything relating to that particular content in the data set, the clustering tool really helps us to do that in an efficient way. And there's further tools available in analysis and relativity that can help you drill down on that content. For example, there are heat maps and other visualization that relativity makes available. So you can look and very quickly access other content that relates to your underlying hot document. And, you can find initially the documents that relate to it to the highest degree or that are the most similar, and go all the way down the chain to documents that just touch on some of the issues in that initial document. So it's very helpful to identify not just what's most important, but anything that might color your analysis of what that document means and what the content or how the content in that document can impact your case. The last data analytics tool we're going to talk about that we use the most is the predictive coding tool. So predictive coding has really come a long way in the last several years, particularly with regard to how it's seen by the courts. I know initially cases required permission before predictive coding can be used. We've now moved beyond that to where courts are allowing parties to make strategic decisions to use predictive coding without obtaining that permission. And they're even, I think it's eventually going to move to the point where predictive coding is going to be required in some cases. We have had a couple of recent cases where courts have said they're not going to require it of parties, but I do think we're heading that direction eventually. The most important question is does TAR make sense for your particular case? And this goes back to the discussion of proportionality. You want to look at what your objectives are, what the amount in controversy is, what the extent, the scope and size of your data set is, and determine whether technology-assisted review can help you achieve your objectives and reduce your costs. Ideally, the use of predictive coding will reduce the amount of linear review that you have to do. And traditional linear review typically accounts for 70% or more of your e-discovery costs for a particular review project. So to the extent you can use technology-assisted review or one of these other analytics tools to reduce the size of your data set, the bigger the impact on your ultimate cost for the review project. And sometimes this, utilizing this tool can have an upfront cost that is heavier than your typical review spin-up cost, but the impact on the back end when you call out all the non-responsive content can be huge and really have an impact on your overall budget. One recent case I wanted to bring up that I think is interesting is Dynamo 2. So in the original Dynamo case, that was one of the examples where the courts said they would accept the use of predictive coding without advance permission. So that case went back down to the district court level, went through some more litigation, and worked its way back up with a second question of whether the coding was the right tool to use or whether it was adequate. So what the court held there was the petitioner was claiming that the ultimate production that was generated by the predictive coding tool was flawed. And the court said even if it was flawed, they actually assumed that it was flawed. The standard was whether a reasonable inquiry was done in order to arrive at the production set. So in considering how predictive coding works and what the actual likelihood of a perfect production is using other processes such as linear review, The court held that predictive coding should be held to the same standard as the linear review process, which is not perfection, but whether or not it was a reasonable inquiry. So the court concluded that predictive coding in and of itself is a reasonable inquiry for the purposes of creating a production of documents. So I think that was a very important case in the overall area of the use of predictive coding in litigation matters that we'll see have some impact down the road. It's strong support for the use of predictive coding to cull documents from a review and use it as a review tool to generate productions. And that's something that some case teams and clients don't have a high comfort level with yet. And a case like this is going to go a long way towards helping to bridge that gap. The general process for predictive coding or assisted review, in relativity at least, is an iterative process. It goes through identifying the information that's relevant, applying the predictive coding categorization to call out non-responsive content and identify responsive content, allowing you to prioritize your review based on those results. You can then QC both the responsive and non-responsive content to help validate those results. What's interesting is the system itself is set up to validate the results for you. It will give you a statistical data point to determine whether or not your results are sufficiently accurate. But if we're combining that with a linear review effort, we always do some QC validation and sampling on our own in conjunction with our QC of our linear review before we generate a production set. So I think taken together, the linear review and predictive coding process can quickly generate a strong and defensible production set utilizing the results of both the human QC and the statistical analysis that's done by the predictive coding tool. Any questions about the use of data analytics in review before we move on to a discussion of the review process itself?
We do have one. Excuse me. We do have one question, Chris. In order to use email threading and the near duplicate detection tools in relativity, does the PST data have to be processed in a different manner than the usual? In other words, do you have to specify upfront that you want to use those tools prior to processing your data?
Not typically. Typically, once you access the PST and process those files into individual email messages, the corresponding metadata that you're going to get from a standard system like Outlook or Lotus Notes is going to give the email threading tool the information it needs to properly organize that data by email thread. And in the example of relativity, it's doing so based strictly on the content of the text, the textual content of those documents. So regardless of what system they came from and how it's organized, all emails are going to have textual content and typically date information and subject line, and utilizing all of that information to the extent you add it to the text index, which can be done at any time. Email threading can take that information and generate a threaded review set for you.
And we have a follow-up question from another attendee. What if the file formats for email are PDFs rather than MSGs?
So that's typically, it's not ideal for use of email threading, but as long as you have good OCR text that's available for purposes of searching, that same text can be used for purposes of building an analytics index and creating an email threading review set. Any further questions about that?
One additional one has just popped up we could address now. Does your opponent get to review and critique your methods, your search terms, etc.? What assurances do they in the court have that the review is complete? Is your status as officer of the court enough?
Yeah, so So that's going to vary depending on what your discovery order says, what agreements you have in place, what your local rules require wherever your particular case is pending. But generally, you do have behind you these multiple federal court cases that say that it is a valid process and it is okay to use it without permission in advance. Because what it's doing is essentially reviewing the documents in the same way that humans would be reviewing the documents. So the end result is you're creating production of documents that have been analyzed, at least in terms of their content, to determine whether or not they're responsive or relevant to your case. The documentation that's created along with or via the relativity assisted review process gives you something you can present to the court, along with the testimony of your provider to validate the process that was used and to back up what your end result and the fact that you performed a valid process. So typically, it's not necessarily something you have to disclose, but there may be exceptions to that depending on, again, what agreements you have in place at the outset of the case in your discovery order, or particular local rules that may relate to the use of these types of tools.
All right, that's all for now.
All right, we will move on to discussing the review process generally. This is all colored by our previous discussion of the use of analytical tools and how we incorporate those in the process. And now we're going to discuss more once you get into human review and looking at actual documents. How do you structure that process to be efficient and to leverage that technology that you've introduced into your workflow previously? So first, it's important to consider your project design and planning from the outset, and what phases of review will you need to undertake, and how best to undertake those in order to have the most efficient budget to get the review done within the time that you have allotted. So frequently we have clients come to us with projects that are at various phases of completion. Sometimes we're talking to a client before the collection has occurred and walking them through that and working with them to collect the data, process the data, host, review it, and then produce it. But we also often, get asked to help with a review that's closer to the production phase. Their production is 2 days away or 10 days away or 30 days away. They've done all the other steps, but now they realize that they don't have enough time to get through all the documents in a linear fashion in front of that production deadline. So there's always going to be that consideration: is where are you in the process, and what is going to be your review plan from here to get from point A to point B. Ideally, you want to start this at prior to the collection phase and design a whole process from end to end that helps you get this done in the most efficient manner possible. To the extent that's not possible, these technology tools and a linear review process utilizing a managed review service can be introduced at any time. It doesn't necessarily have to be considered or introduced at the outset. It's important when you're designing your budget to consider time. If you have 30 days or 60 days or 90 days to produce documents, you can't look at just the review phase for how long it's going to take to get through those documents. You have to consider how long it's going to take to collect it, how long it's going to take to process it, and then review it, and then produce it. There's going to be timelines and constraints around each of those phases, so you want to build a plan that considers the length of time needed for each phase, and the one that's flexible typically is the review piece. Once you have determined how long it's going to take to perform your collection, how long it's going to take to process the data and get it up in a review database, and how long it's going to take to create that production, that tells you how many days you have in order to complete the review, and then you can staff and plan your review from there. If it's a very tight timeline and a large data set, you're most likely going to want to utilize technology-assisted review because that's typically able to get through large data sets in a more efficient manner than a review team. Or it may be a situation where your data or your process doesn't lend itself to the use of assisted review, and you need to staff a very large team in order to get through that. So you might need 50 attorneys or 90 attorneys or 120 attorneys or whatever the case may be. So you need to be sure you're working with a vendor who is able to put together a review of that size. Once you've figured out those timelines and what your time budget looks like, you need to next turn to your cost budget and consider the cost of each phase of the review. And again, you can build into your process how and when you're going to utilize technology based on how you need to get through that review phase and how quickly you need to get through that review phase. Again, if you have a large data set, technology-assisted review might cost 40% more in the processing phase and in the review training phase than you were anticipating, but it might reduce your overall review cost by 60%, and therefore you come out way ahead. So it's important when you're building this budget to consider your timelines and how to use these tools in such a way to both, one, help you meet that timeline, and two, help reduce your cost. And in most cases, utilizing technology can do both of those things. And then finally, as we discussed, we need to determine what size pool of labor do you need in order to get this done. If we're going to have a linear review component, which we do in 95% of our projects, you need to consider both first pass review, QC review, the management of those teams, and something that's not on the list is privilege review and privilege logging. In most cases, you do end up needing to generate a privilege log, and that's an additional phase of human review that you need to incorporate into your budget for both time and cost purposes. In our situation, we typically try to have one QC reviewer for every 5 or 6 first pass reviewers. So if you need a team of 16 first pass reviewers in order to get through your data set in your 2-week timeline, likely you'll want to add another 4 QC reviewers or so for a team size of 20 to make sure that you can get through that component of the review and quality check all of the work done by that first pass team within that 2-week timeline. Then finally, you need to allow time for your production. Typically, this depends on the size of production, but it can typically take anywhere from 1 day to 3 or 4 days to get a production set out. Our team can typically turn it around in a day or two, but it's something that needs to be accounted for in a process. You need to determine, what day of the week is your production on? Is your provider 24/7 like exact, or do they not work on weekends or have limited weekend availability? And do you need to add in that time to your production timeline in order to make sure you can meet your deadline? Any questions about review budgets and timelines? All right, we're going to move on to overall just the review process. This is a process map that we follow for a typical litigation first pass review. So typically, if we're engaged with a client to conduct a review for a litigation matter where we're working towards creating a production and a privilege log, these are the steps we follow. We initially work with the client to establish a workflow for the project and develop a review protocol that accomplishes their desired objectives. So that involves understanding what are the issues in the case, what is the scope of response, what are the relevant issues that need to be present in a document in order to make it responsive or even hot, if we're cool with that. And then we want to select a team that's going to best help us accomplish those objectives. If it's a securities matter, we want to select a review team that has that particular expertise and understands the intricacies of those types of cases, has experience, at least at the review level, in working on those kinds of matters. If it's a Hatch-Waxman project, we want to put together a team that has familiarity with those concepts and those processes. If it's an IP matter, same thing. We look for a group that has the appropriate background to successfully conduct that linear review in that particular case. Once we've put that team together, we work closely with the client to substantively train them on that particular case. And that typically involves having someone from the client's case team who is a subject matter expert on the particular case to come in and give us an overview of what the case is about, what the issues are, what they want to see in terms of identifying documents or hot documents, and overall prepare our reviewers to get through that data set and achieve the client's objectives in the most efficient way possible. Once we've completed that step, we'll begin the first pass review. And at the same time, usually starting on day 2, maybe day 3 for a larger or longer review, we'll begin the QC review process, where we have our QC team checking the work of the first pass reviewers and providing them feedback in an iterative fashion as we go forward to make sure that everyone stays on the same page and on task and has a full understanding of the process. As part of that, we'll generate typically a question log where we're cataloging all of our questions that we have for the client's case team, and we'll have usually daily discussions, sometimes daily calls, sometimes just daily emails back and forth of the question log, providing that client feedback and helping us answer difficult questions about the documents, and it's particularly important early on in a review to make sure that our review effort is successful and that we're most likely categorizing the documents in the way the client wants to see them categorized. Once we're off and running with that and we start turning towards our production deadline, we do 2 things. We do a QC review of statistical random samples to validate our review results. So we'll look at, for example, 5 to 10% of documents categorized non-responsive to validate that we're properly identifying what is not responsive. And then we'll look at usually a higher percentage, 15, 20, 25% of documents that are responsive to make sure we're accurately capturing those. And those 2 functions help us create a production set that's as complete and as accurate as possible. And then we also, as we start to define that production set, undertake a production QC process where we're double checking everything going into production for completeness, for issues of privilege that may require withholding a document or redacting a document, anything that may be relevant to or need to be pulled from production because it's outside of timelines or maybe needs a second look from the client, something along those lines. So those 2 processes we undertake typically with the production QC step has some client involvement as well. As we move towards that production, we've identified the responsive documents that are going into production. We've identified the privileged, either wholly or partially privileged documents that need to either be redacted and produced or withheld and logged. Any questions about that process? Okay, so once you begin your review, it's important to set up your database in such a way that you're accomplishing your review objectives in an efficient manner. So at the outset of your review, you want to structure your workflow around your review objectives. If you are working towards creating a production and litigation, you obviously want to structure your review workflow to consider what is or is not going to be produced. And that will include identifying responsiveness and identifying privilege. If your review is an internal investigation and you're investigating whether your client has exposure under a particular legal or compliance issue, such as FCPA claims or kickbacks or something like that, import or export controls. Those types of reviews, you're looking more at content and responsiveness and not so much at privilege, and you're not creating a production. So you want to design your workflow around getting the information you need in order to determine that level of exposure and complete your investigation. Both of these things are best achieved through early interaction with the case team, the lit support or PM team at your provider, and the review team and their management. So we've developed a process at Exact where we have our e-discovery project managers and our review managers integrated from step one all the way through production through every step of the process. So we're both working together and often working together with our forensic team to help our clients design a review workflow and a review process that's going to get this done in the most efficient manner possible. Any questions about the review process or structuring your database setup in your workflow to accomplish your objectives?
I have one question about the review process, Chris.
Sure.
How many documents per hour would you consider a reasonable rate of review for each review phase?
It really depends on the what decisions you're asking the reviewers to make. If it's something that's just a first cut look at responsiveness and you're looking at emails, you should see reviewers doing 60 documents an hour or more, and that's a document a minute, so that's pretty fast. And sometimes it can go higher because all they're doing is looking at a one-page or less document for one issue. But most often you're asking reviewers to make 4 or 5 decisions per document, and they're considering issues of privilege, they're considering topical issues beyond responsiveness that documents may or may not relate to, and often they're looking at documents that are several pages in length. They're attachments, PDFs or spreadsheets that can be, large. So it really depends on what your objectives are and what your data looks like. But typically, in most cases, especially if it's a long review, we see teams anywhere from 50 to 75 documents an hour in a litigation review where they're looking for issues of responsiveness and privilege. But if you're doing something more complex than that, it can be slower, such as a privilege log or redactions. If they're doing something simpler than that and just answering one question like whether or not a document is responsive or relevant, it can go faster. All right, so once you've established your workflow, you can utilize user permissions in your review database to accomplish those objectives. In relativity, at least, you can have multiple groups that are working in the same workspace, but performing different functions, and have each group's permission structured around what those functions are. So it's always important to make sure that the first level reviewers only have access to the coding layout that they need in order to tag a document at the first level, and that the privilege review and privilege team has access to the coding panel that they need to see in order to accomplish that objective. Your QC team needs their own coding layout to make their decisions regarding each document. And then likewise, you want to assign those documents out to the correct team. So you manage that process by batching and by creating views so that teams are only seeing particular documents that they need to see in order to accomplish their respective objectives. And then you want to create views where they can see the information they need to see about each document. So a first level reviewer, it's more important that their views show them the available metadata. They need to see who the senders and recipients are. They can QC their batch to determine if any lawyers are present or outside counsel are present just by scanning the senders and recipients on particular documents. But the QC reviewers, in addition to that, they need to see what decisions the first level reviewers made with those documents, and they can drill down on whether or not a document's tagged privileged, whether or not a document's tagged responsive, in addition to seeing the other metadata about that document that might help them determine if those calls are correct. Relativity securities are very granular, and we can set it up in very specific ways to make sure that each team only has access to need in order to get through the documents in a more efficient manner. It's also a security consideration. You want to make sure that you don't have the wrong team seeing the wrong information. Sometimes we have shared databases where you might have expert witnesses in a particular data set doing work, but they don't necessarily need access to data outside of what the case teams authorize them to review, so you need to make sure that your securities are set up to prevent that. Likewise, you may have co-counsel accessing a database, and there's particular work product that you need to shield from them so that you maintain privilege. So those are all considerations that you need to put in place when you're setting up your database and managing your workflow in any review project. It's also important, to the extent you can, to automate the privilege log process and to consider the privilege log from the outset of the review. If you know that you're reviewing documents for production, that you're going to be creating a privilege log in a case, you want to put into your first pass workflow, to the extent you can, what information you're going to ultimately need in that privilege, or what information that makes sense for the first level team to categorize. So, and more often than not, that'll be something as simple as type. Is this attorney-client, or is this work product, or is it both? And then you can kick it up to a privilege log team for creating actual document descriptions and creating your actual log. But that initial step of considering the type of privilege and whether something should be completely withheld or just redacted in part, that can make the process of creating the privilege log more efficient down the road. Any questions about setting up your database or your workspace permissions before we wrap up? All right, so our key takeaways are, one, leveraging subject matter expertise to help you build efficiencies. As I mentioned early on, it's important to have someone that really knows the case, really knows the players, really understands the types of data and where the data sits, in order to put together a plan that's most efficient from end to end to ensure that you're collecting the right data, processing only what you need, reviewing only what you need, and then putting together a workflow that answers only the questions that you need answered about that particular data. You can use technology to amplify that subject matter expertise. If your subject matter expert can point you to a particular custodian or two or three that had involvement in the issues that are central to your case, you can use technology to identify who they were communicating with and when and how, and what the content of those communications were, and whether they related to the same issues that are at issue in your case. And that can help you drill down on the most important information very quickly without having to do kind of a broad sweep or broad search or date range search or broad custodial collections beyond that which you need to do in order to find the particular information at issue. It's important to consider how you can incorporate technology into each step of the process, both identifying responsive documents or potentially relevant documents, calling out things from the review that don't need to be there, whether it's because they're outside a date range, related to something else or otherwise not relevant, or whether they belong to custodians or the particular file types that aren't likely to create or contain relevant content. For example, file types that don't have user-created content. You can call those out initially from your collection just by examining what file types are there and which ones contain potentially user-created content. And then you can use technology to prioritize your review. You can determine from the technology-assisted review results or from email threading analysis which custodians you need to review first, where your potentially relevant information most likely sits, and to help you identify quickly that content that's likely to go into a production. You can utilize it during the review phase to organize your review and streamline your review, and you can utilize it during the QC phase to help you find inconsistencies between similar or related documents and verify whether the coding is correct or needs to be adjusted. Any questions about any of the topics we discussed, whether they be review or the use of technology in review, or more general concepts such as proportionality or searching and culling?
No, it looks like you have addressed all the questions, Chris.
All right. Well, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, everyone, for joining. And Matt,
yes,
I'll let you wrap up.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for the excellent presentation. We certainly appreciate it, and thank you all for attending and spending the hour with us. As my colleague Bob Loram said at the top of the hour, you'll be receiving an email from us tomorrow containing a copy of these presentation materials, as well as a link to the recording and a link to a survey to provide us with feedback on the program or to let us know about other topics you'd like to see covered in a future webinar. And speaking of future webinars, next month on Wednesday, June the 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, I will be presenting our next webinar, which will be on social media in e-discovery. We'll be covering both technical and legal issues associated with social media as a new and common problem that we are all facing in our practice of e-discovery. As Bob noted at the top, you can also visit our website in the Learn section to find a variety of articles, blog posts, white papers, and other educational and reference materials. And if you'd like to engage with Chris Chapman further or have other follow-up questions that you didn't have a chance to ask on this program, please feel free to reach out to him at the email address on your screen. Thank you again for participating, and we hope to see you all back here again next month.